Okay. Jimmy, do you want to introduce our speakers?
Testing. This is the fun part of the job. Our first speaker, well, the title, of course, is Bird Detectives, but our first speaker is a program director of the Feather Identification Lab at the Smithsonian Institute Natural Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. She directs a program specifically tailored for determining species of birds from microscopic evidence, DNA analysis, and by using the museum's vast research collection of birds to identify the feathers. Her work is essentially to the field of aviation. Her work is essential to the field of aviation safety and is used in studies of prey remains, food contaminations, and in identification of birds used on anthropological artifacts. She received her Bachelor's of Science from the University of Montana as well as a Master's of Science from Georgia University. I hope that's not her. Anyway, our first speaker is Miss Carla J. Dove. Welcome, Carla. Our second speaker needs no introduction. She's a lifelong birder. I think she was born with an right there. She's author of the founding of Birding for Fun. She has organizational offering guided tours, workshops, and family-friendly events meant to make birding accessible to everyone. She's a proud Texas Master Naturalist from the class of 2016, which a lot of us from 2016, and she is a past president. She's full of energy. She thinks outside the box, and we're lucky to have her, and that is Miss Kristine Rivers. So, ladies, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jimmy. I am actually going to be speaking first. Let me try to station here. Can y'all see that all right? Can everybody see that?
Yes, we see
and can you hear me in the room?
We can hear you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I am very excited to be talking to you with my co-author, Carla, about our book, Smithsonian Bird Detectives, that came out this January. So I don't want to steal any of Carla's thunder, but I wanted to just introduce her briefly by telling you about our process of putting the book together. So it was published by Capstone Editions on January 1st of 2023, and it is an educational nonfiction title for kids ages 8 and up with a reading level of 4th and higher, although we certainly think it's of interest to adults as well. And to back up a little bit, I was very excited back in January of 2022 to be asked if I would be interested in working on a book with Carla about the work that they do at the Feather Identification Lab at the Division of Birds at the Smithsonian. And so, of course, I said yes, I would love to do that, and jumped at the opportunity to do that. And I took a deep dive into all of the material that I could find on the subject, and then met with Carla. And I was a little bit nervous at first, to be honest, but soon discovered that the two of us have a lot in common. We both discovered a love for birds at a very young age, and both have spent our lifetime fascinated by them and enjoying learning about them. My role in creating the book was really to kind of create a narrative and weave a narrative that would engage kids, to lead them through the book in learning about the important work that they do there in the Feather Identification Lab, and to help make real world connections that kids could latch onto about what kind of work is done and how important it is to our everyday lives, especially as it relates to air travel safety. I don't want to take away from any of Carla's information, but I thought it would be fun to share with you a couple of the things that were my favorite things that I learned about when working on this book with Carla. This amazing lady right here is Roxy Colley Laybourne. She was born in 1910 and passed away at the age of 92 years old. She was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, the eldest of 15 kids, and at a time when higher education was not really necessarily encouraged for women, she pursued it anyway. And she went to an all-girls college, Meredith College, and received her Bachelor of Arts in 1932. During that time, she didn't necessarily prescribe to the traditional roles for women. Her interests were the outdoors and animals, engines, and model airplanes, all things which were frowned upon for women at that time. She was the first woman at that all-girls school to wear jeans, so I like to think she was a little bit of a rebel. She also attended George Washington University and received her Master of Science in Plant Ecology in 1951. But she really wanted to attend aviation school and wasn't allowed to do that because she was female. She did complete an aeronautics correspondence course, though, and spent some of her time in college working repairing aircraft engines. She worked at the National Fisheries Laboratory in Beaufort, North Carolina, and North Carolina State Museum before hiring on as a museum aide in 1944 in the Smithsonian's Division of Birds, with the job of creating study skins. She was a very talented ornithologist and a skilled taxidermist. And after about 15 years of preparing thousands of research study skins, she began to detect microscopic differences in feather structures that could be used to identify birds down to the species level. And she developed identification techniques for doing that. As such, in 1960, there was a fatal crash at Logan Airport in Boston that was caused by a bird strike. And Carla's going to tell you more about that. But it turned out that because she had a very unique skill set of being a skilled airplane mechanic as well as an ornithologist, she helped assist the Federal Aviation Administration in determining the species of birds that caused that crash. And they began a program where they were collecting samples, and it's still done to this day, from every bird strike, which is a collision between an airplane and a bird. And they started sending them to the Smithsonian for identification. And she founded the Feather Identification Lab that you're going to be learning about tonight. And they still, to this day, use the techniques that she established when she began the field of forensic ornithology. And she did that at a time when most scientific studies were done by men. Carla is going to tell us more about her. She had the pleasure of getting to study with and work with Roxy. The other fun thing that I learned about was that the Feather Identification Lab once received samples from a feather pillow that was discovered in an ancient Viking boat grave in a Norwegian bog. And the pillow dated back to AD 800 to 1050. You can see in the inset there a picture of a sample of that pillow stuffing. And as you might imagine, being that old, those feathers were very brittle. Carla and her colleagues in Norway worked together to study those samples for clues to try to figure out what species of birds had feathers that were used in that pillow. So we are going to try some audience interaction here. Kathy, if you want to yell out whatever anybody says in the room, and then we also have chat open. But they discovered that there were 3 families of birds whose feathers were used for pillow stuffing. So, real quick, can y'all guess which 3 families of birds those might have been?
What do y'all think? Geese, waterfowl, geese. I'm sorry, who else said puffins? Swans. Anything else?
Wow.
Okay.
That is a lot of good guesses. Unfortunately, I don't think any of them are correct.
Oh, gosh.
Waterfowl is correct, though. After extensive research, they figured out that eiders were used. As you know, eider down is still used to this day for stuffing pillows and duvets and comforters and jackets, and it was in use that far back as well. In the picture here, you can see one of the cleaned up feathers that they were able to retrieve from that sample in the center there. And they are using forceps to very carefully compare it to a specimen of a great cormorant, and were able to match it down to species level. And then also they found that gulls' feathers were used as well. All right, with no further ado, I have the great honor of introducing my co-author, Carla Dove, who is going to take it from here. But first, because I know how all of you are, I would just like to go ahead and say, yes, her name is Dove. And yes, that was her maiden name. It's her name that she's had her entire life. And yes, it is ironic. So with that out of the way, I will go ahead and stop sharing and let Carla take over.
Thank you, Kristine, and thank you everybody for inviting us tonight. This is, I don't know if Kristine told you, but this is our first introduction of the book. This is our first time together doing this kind of a thing. So you guys can give us some feedback on how you think we do. Can everybody see this? Can you see the National Museum of Natural History slide?
We see
I
it.
can.
All right, here we go. Thank you again for inviting me to join in with you guys tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do, but before I do, I just want to say Kristine is amazing, and there's no way that a little book like this could have ever been done without her, because it was her influence and her ability to tell a story that made this little book such a great little book, I think. I mean, I had the technical information, but I didn't know how to weave a story in through the book and to make it interesting to kids. And a lot of times scientists are not great communicators. And so we are more successful when we collaborate. And that's why I think this has been such a great project to work on. So thank you so much, Kristine, for all your help and influence on doing this little book. I love it. I think it's great. And it's fun to be here tonight with you guys to tell you about what we really do back here behind the scenes at the National Museum of Natural History. I hope some of you have been there and visited our museum. We are located on the mall, and we're one of 13 different museums that are a part of the Smithsonian complex. If you come into our building, you see this great big rotunda with an elephant in the middle, and all of these floors above the rotunda are full of exhibits. And a lot of people come into this building and they spend the day there or a couple days there, and they think they've seen it all. But if you've been there, you know it's really difficult to do that. And there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes that most of the public really don't have any clue of what goes on behind the scenes at a research museum. You know, we do things, of course we do things like document and survey animals, but we also look into disease. We do, you know, artists come and use our collections all the time to study, you know, patterns and plumages and different kinds of animals for field guides and for books. You know, we have extinct species behind the scenes. We do lots of environmental pollutant studies. We have people come in that look at zoonosis diseases and genomics. And all kinds of wonderful things are happening in museum collections now. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight is identifications, and specifically our work on forensics identifications. So I know that you guys know all about all things natural, so I'm sure that a lot of you are interested in birds, and you maybe are also will look at a bird and understand the beauty in the feathers and the variation that occurs in the feathers of birds. And if you just try to imagine, you know, if you're out doing your naturalist thing and you find a single feather, trying to figure out what bird that came from can be challenging. But there's such a diversity in feathers and color and types and ages of birds and geographic distributions of birds. All of these things add to the diversity of the feathers. There are different types of feathers. So if you just have a single feather, you need to know what part of the bird's body the feather came from. Is it a bristle? Is it a wing feather? Is it a tail feather? Is it a body feather? Where did the feather come from on the bird's body? That might help you visualize what kind of bird the feather came from. Where on the bird's body? Birds have all kinds of specialized feathers. You know, things like the rooster. I mean, the chickens and pheasants have beautiful feathers, but if you can just imagine plucking one of those off and looking at the variation within the feathers on a bird's body, it's really quite incredible if you think about it. So we have some audience participation a little bit here. You can either answer in the chat or somebody can call it out. Feather identification is actually quite easy. I'm sure some of you are looking at this feather right now, and you probably can tell me what part of the bird's body it came from, and you might even have a guess as to what species of bird this feather came from. Anybody want to guess?
Here in the room, I hear tail feather,
Oh, it's a tail feather. Very good.
turkey.
It's red.
What else? Hawk.
Red-tailed hawk. Very good.
Oh,
So this is an adult red-tailed hawk. If it was a juvenile red-tailed hawk, the tail feather would be quite different. Okay, here's another one. You guys have a lot of these in Texas.
I hear dove,
Mockingbird.
mockingbird.
Good guess. It is tail feather. How about mourning dove? It's the outer tail feather here being matched up to a museum study skin of a mourning dove. This one's a little tricky, but it's also tail feather. That's the outer tail feather. This is the central tail feather. Any guesses?
It's strange quiet here in the room.
I know. So this is an American kestrel, but if you'll notice, this is a female picture, and her tail is quite different from the male. So it does depend sometimes on the sexual variation of the species as to what the feather is. And you'll notice on this photograph, there's a very beautiful outer tail feather of an American kestrel that matches up perfectly with this unknown feather, and this is the central tail feather. So even on the same part of the body, the tail can sometimes vary as to what the feather looks like. Okay, here's another one. This is a body feather. And this is tail feather that goes with it. Guesses?
Flicker.
Yay!
Yes!
That's flicker.
I did.
Very good.
Yay!
And this is
I said flicker because our flickers in Northern California were orange instead of yellow, so they're very similar.
That's right. That's exactly right. They have the red shaft, and this is the yellow shafted. So you can see it. This is a great example of how a feather may differ depending on the part of the body that it came from. So there really isn't a way to write a key to this kind of work, because I mean, like in plants, you can do that because there's consistency in one plant, but here it's variation all over the whole body of the bird. So you really have to really put a lot of this to memorization. And that's kind of how Roxy did it, was she had somewhat of a photographic memory for some of these things. One more, this is, you guys probably won't know this one because it's pretty much an Eastern bird, but this is a Baltimore Oriole, which is a very beautiful bird. And then finally, if any of you ever see a feather like this, please call me right away. This is a feather from an ivory-billed woodpecker, which is now extinct. And occasionally people report seeing them, but this is a bird that went extinct in about 1950s. It was a bird that loved old growth forests. It was a loner kind of species and was prominent in the southeastern United States, Louisiana. The last reported sighting of it was in the 50s. There were some speculative sightings in the early 2000s, and Cornell University went to all these locations and put sound boxes out and tried to find these birds and didn't have any luck finding another sighting. So most people think this is an extinct bird now, but we do have these at the Museum of Natural History in our collections. Our collections are about 150 years old, and birds have been added to that collection throughout the whole history of the museum. This is Roxy again, as Kristine said. She is credited with being the pioneer of forensic ornithology, which was taking these small feather fragments of birds and trying to figure out what species of birds the feathers belong to. And by doing that, you can learn a lot about what these birds are and why they are where they are. And then you can do something to either help conserve them, protect them, or help them from becoming issues with human-wildlife conflicts. So what we study at our lab is the very smallest division of the feather. So if you have a whole feather, this is the pennaceous part. The part at the base is the fluffy part, and that's called the plumulaceous part. If you pull off one of those barbs, it looks sort of like a miniature feather. It has this little rachis with the little barbules on each side. And if you split that even further, one of these little pieces of filament actually enlarged becomes the barbule. And it's on this barbule where we look for characteristics that will help us determine the group of birds that the feather belongs to. And we do, most of our work is involves identification of bird strikes. And we do about 10,000 cases a year. These bird strike events can cause millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of damage to aircraft and delays, and even can cause death. So what we're trying to do with our work is to identify the species of birds so that we can then send people out on the airfields to look at the habitat and determine what it is they could do to keep birds from being attracted to that area, the airport. And the reason they do that is because about 95% of the bird strikes occur on takeoff and landing. Once you get above a certain altitude, which is about 3,000 feet, the chances of hitting a bird go down tremendously. So keeping birds away from that immediate environment is the goal. There's a lot of different damages. You can see here some examples. And this has been happening for a long time. As long as birds and humans are flying together, we are going to have bird strikes. Orville Wright. What's that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Orville Wright had a bird strike. Was the first reported bird strike. And I just wanted to point out here that the Smithsonian Institution was established in 1846. So they were the forefathers of our collections, were already gathering specimens and collecting things way before there were even airplanes invented. So there is no way that they would have known what we would be using the collections for today. And that's one of the reasons that we continue to build our collections and maintain our collections, is because we really don't know what they're going to be used for in the future. The first fatality was Cal Rogers in California. And as Kristine said earlier, Roxy became involved really right around 1960 when this crash in Boston Harbor killed 62 people. And when they brought the engines up out of the water, they found feathers in the engine and sent those to the Smithsonian. And Roxy identified those birds as European starlings. Some of you may remember U.S. Airways Flight 1549 that went into the Hudson River. That was one of the recent bird strikes that really brought this whole thing to the forefront again. It's not just large birds that can cause damage. There's a radon picture of radon damage from some small birds, a flock of juncos and robins. And then one of the most common birds that's involved in bird strikes is the horned lark, and they average about $5,000 a strike. And then mourning doves are also commonly hit because they love to hang out on airfields and they love to eat the grass seed, and they average about $5,000 a strike. So it is costly. It's not just birds. We also hit mammals, and we do commonly get bat strikes. Last year, we had 676 bats from 28 different species. So if it flies, it is a potential issue. And again, the whole point is to keep birds and aircraft apart. So knowing the species of birds is the key information that the airfield managers need on how to manage these species. And Roxy's little lab has now grown to 5 people, and we process about 10,000 cases a year for both civil and military aviation. We're sponsored, funded by interagency agreements with the FAA, the Navy, and the U.S. Air Force. We get lots of packages. Right now is a very busy time of the year. Today we got about 60 packages in the mail, all different kinds of samples. I will tell you that our mailroom gets very upset when we receive something like this because it can get quite smelly in the mailroom, and they immediately want us to come down and pick up our samples. We have a few tools in our toolbox. First being the morphological characteristics of the feather. So we do still use Roxy's method by washing up the feathers and cleaning them up, and then taking them out into our collection and matching them up with museum specimens. Sometimes we just get bills, sometimes we get single feathers, different parts of the bird's body. But one of the reasons that we can do this so well is that we have a library of about 500,000 bird specimens right outside our door at the museum. This is Roxy standing in one of our aisles, and we have about 13 aisles of museum specimens. These are all prepared, as Kristine said earlier, as museum study skins. So they are stuffed with cotton. The data, scientific data, is on the label, and those specimens will be in those drawers for hundreds of years because they are properly cared for and maintained. Well, some of our samples nowadays don't really consist of whole feathers. They consist of what we call snarge, which is bird ick. Bird ick is just either tissue, blood, or whatever's left of the bird on the aircraft, kind of like a bug splat on your windshield. And so this material is wiped off and submitted to our lab, and we can do DNA analysis with that. This is where the molecular component of our work comes in. And we have a huge lab right downtown at the Museum of Natural History where we can do our molecular work. We have a dedicated DNA specialist who works on the snarge cases. We use what's called DNA barcoding, and this is available for plants and birds and animals. It's a small snippet of mitochondrial DNA, only about 650 base pairs. And the reason they call it a barcode is because if you squish all the A, C, T's, and G's together, it's just like zeros and ones on a barcode at the supermarket. And you can actually get a specific barcode for individual species of birds. And this works great for most species of birds. There are some problems, some closely related species or species that hybridize, but this is really a great tool for identification of things. Again, we use the CO1 part of the mitochondrial genome. There's an online database. There's an online portal. It's called the Barcode of Life database. So you just take your sequence, you copy it, and you paste it into this online portal. You hit submit, and it will come back with your match of your unknown sequence to whatever is in that DNA library. In this case, it's 100% matched to a wood duck. And there are several different individuals of wood ducks in the database, so that builds my confidence that this sequence is from a wood duck, and that's how we do it. Now, sometimes the DNA doesn't work. It's either too degraded, or it's been sitting around in somebody's office, or it's been heated, or it has fuel oil on it. A host of problems will cause DNA failures, and so that's when Roxy's method really comes in, and this is where my expertise it really is useful, and that is in the microscopic analysis of the feathers. So again, we'll go over it. There's two parts of a feather as far as we're concerned. The distal part is this pennaceous part that has the color and the texture. And this is the part of the feather where you see the hooklets. In the textbooks, you will see this kind of example. This is what helps the feathers lock together and helps form the airfoil for the birds to fly and to protect their bodies. The base of the feather is the downy part and the fluffy part, and almost all feathers have this. Body feathers have more of it than wing feathers and tail feathers, but it's usually present. And in those little barbules is where we see these microscopic characteristics that vary among orders of birds. Some of those characteristics at the nodes may be star-shaped or pronged or ring-shaped. We also look at where the pigment is in the microscopic characters. Is it at the node? Is it interstippled at the inner node? What's the location of the pigment in these microscopic feathers? And here are some examples. So hawks and eagles have these long barbules with spines at the nodes, and then they have this lovely internodal pigment that's sort of stippled throughout. Waterfowl are very diagnostic. They have these triangular shaped nodes that are only distal on the barbules. Owls also very diagnostic, very long barbules. The base of the barbules have pigmented nodes that flare out, but the tips of the barbules have this elongated morphological feature at the nodes. So very different between the base and the distal part of the barbule. Hummingbirds are beautiful. They have these lovely star-shaped nodes. Some of these are scanning electron photomicrographs. We use those just to understand what the feather structures look like. We use light microscopy for identifications. And here's a crow that has a lot of different nodes along the barbules. So if we have something like a turkey or a galliform, we're going to see nodes that have these ring shapes, almost like a curtain rod. And this is the example that we used in the book, because it's very easy for people to see this, and we thought that children would understand this easily. Whereas the Anseriformes or the waterfowl have these triangular shaped nodes, and they're only located distally on these barbules. So we have all these tools in the toolbox, DNA and morphology, but we still have to really think about what we're doing. And this is an example here of a case that I call mind over molecules. So we had a sample, you can see it right here at the top, from Randolph Air Force Base in Texas. The bird strike occurred on the 14th of January, and the only material we had available was this cheesecloth with a snarge on it. So we clipped out a little piece of this, and we sent it to the DNA lab, and it came back as white-tailed deer. Okay, well, that's a little odd because we do get deer in bird strikes, but it usually occurs on the runway or takeoff and landing, and they can do a lot of damage. But the report said that the bird strike actually occurred at 1,500 feet above the ground. So we looked at the date and we were like, okay, it is just after January, so maybe it's Rudolph. But of course, we knew that couldn't be the case. So we called the pilot, and the pilot said, maybe he made a mistake. Maybe he recorded this the altitude incorrectly. So we wanted to make sure that the data was right. And he was like, no, I know it was definitely 1,500 feet above the ground, because it did like $40,000 worth of damage to the wing of my aircraft. I know, I felt it hit. I heard it hit. It was definitely at that altitude. And so we went back to the sample and we made a microslide from the little bloody material that we had on that cheesecloth. And sure enough, I did find some feather barbs in there that matched up perfectly to a black vulture. And black vulture, of course, being a carrion feeder, was very likely feeding on the deer carcass. The plane took off, scared up the bird. The bird collided with the airplane. The material from the crop exploded on the aircraft, and that was what the bird was eating and not actually what the bird was. So this was a very important lesson to us, because we had come to be very dependent on the DNA analysis, and then we realized you still need to use all of those tools that you have in your toolbox for this kind of forensic work, because the story has to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, you have to go back to the drawing board and start over again. The other story I wanted to tell you about was we did some really detailed analysis with the Flight 1549 case. We got, instead of getting one sample from this case, we got about 70 samples. And that's because when the engineers were going into the engine and pulling out the material, they wanted to determine how far back into the engine birds actually penetrated. And they wanted to also verify the species identification. Captain Sullenberger did say it was Canada geese, but there are two species of geese up in New York that look very similar. One is a Brant goose that weighs about 2 to 4 pounds. And the other, of course, is the Canada goose, which is a very big bird, 8 to 10 pound bird. And the engines on that aircraft were designed to take a 2 to 4 pound bird and keep functioning. So the GE engine manufacturers were very nervous about what the species of bird was. And so they breathed a sigh of relief when they heard that it was actually a Canada goose. Now the new 777 engine, all engines have to go through a bird test. And the new 777 engines are designed to take an 8 to 10 pound bird and keep flying. So they did actually use our data on bird weights to improve the safety standards of the engines of aircraft today. We also did some isotopic analysis with the feathers from that engine just to determine if the birds were from a resident population or a migratory population. And we used hydrogen isotopes for this case. So we extracted the isotopes from the feather, and then we compared them to the profiles along the country of the United States. And we found that the values from the feathers from the engine actually matched up better with the values from Canada. So we knew that the birds had bred and molted their feathers and grew in the new feathers on their breeding grounds up in Canada, and were down in New York for the winter because they were migrating around and looking for food because it was a very cold time of the year. So they were not migrating at that time. They were already here, but they were from a migratory population and not the resident birds that, by the way, are controlled on the airport there at JFK by various methods. So is it working? Yes, it is working. The data that we have that shows that bird strike reporting keeps increasing over time, and that's likely because reporting is better and people are more educated now about what they can do if they know what the species of birds are. And since the year 2000, when they put biologists on all certificated airports, the number of damaging strikes has significantly decreased. So having a biologist on the airport, knowing what the species of birds are and how to mitigate the habitat is working to reduce the damaging bird strikes. It's working to save the birds. In this field, you can become a talking head very quickly. We were just on an NBC News 2 weeks ago when a plane took off from American Airlines flight 1958, took off from Columbus to Phoenix, and again ingested some Canada geese into the engines of the aircraft and had to make a landing. I don't know the full report yet, but I think that engine actually shut down. So they landed that airplane on one engine. Again, the idea here is to keep the birds and the airplanes apart because the birds are not going to win when they encounter an airplane in their way. And so we like to think that we are working to keep the sky safer for everybody who flies, not just people, but also for birds. As Kristine mentioned, we do work on other things. Occasionally, we had a project here where we were identifying the feathers on some Chinese jewelry. This was from the Freer-Sackler Gallery of Art. We've looked at feathers in amber to try to identify the groups of birds that these feathers came from. We do some anthropological work to identify species of birds on anthropological items to help determine what significance birds had in different cultures. And also when loans and things or exhibits are sent to other countries, the feathers on these items need to be identified so that the proper permits can be requested for transporting these items across borders. Some more anthropological work that we have done. We help customs out sometimes because they will get items. Although you can go to a foreign country and buy these beautiful feathered items at the markets, they're not legal to bring back into the country. And there are lots of laws that protect birds, as you all probably know. And so these things can be seized at customs. And then they can be sent to us or to the forensics lab in Ashland, Oregon. to do the identifications. And sometimes they turn out to be domestic chickens or turkeys that are just died and people can have their material. But a lot of times when you go to a foreign country and go to the markets, lots of things are for sale that are not legal. So just be careful of that if you ever have that experience. Again, the Fish and Wildlife Service, we work with them often on identification of poached items and of items that are illegally taken. This was an interesting project. The Burmese python in Florida. Some of you probably know about this invasive non-native species that is sort of wreaking havoc on the Everglades. Turns out they are also eating birds, and this is a picture of the gut contents from a Burmese python. Well, they sent us this material, and if you just kind of clean this up a little bit, take it out, wash it up, they fluff up nicely, and you could match them up perfectly with museum specimens of white ibises. And it turns out we've identified somewhere around 25 different species of birds now that this python has eaten in the Everglades, mainly rails and coots and cranes and egrets, which is really bad because not only have they sort of wiped out the mammals now, but now they're going to work on the birds. Very opportunistic, invasive species that must be controlled. Just a little bit about me before I end up. I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley, going around playing in streams and creeks and climbing up trees. There I am in the 1st grade, my little dress on. As soon as I got home, I'd take my dress off and go outside and run around. But from that little community in Falks Run and loving the outdoors, I decided to go out to the University of Montana and get my bachelor's degree there. And that's where I learned how to skin birds and stuff specimens. So when I came back to the East Coast and started looking for jobs, I had that experience of skinning birds. And that's what got me the job at the Smithsonian. And that's where I met Roxy. And Roxy was looking for an assistant at that time and someone to study feathers. So I got my PhD in 1998 with Roxy as my offsite advisor. And from that point on, I just started working with her and studying feathers. And now Roxy's little lab has grown to 5 people. And that's it. I mean, then I met Kristine, and now we have a little book, and that's where 30 years of my life went. I can answer questions, or let me see if there's anything in the chat. There's
Hey, Carla. One of the
yes.
things that I found interesting that we were not able to include in the book that I thought this crowd might find interesting is the rooster booster.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell them about that?
So the rooster booster would not have worked in the book. True. The rooster booster is sort of like a gun that shoots birds from this cannon-like object into engines that are actually airplane engines that are running, and it's a test. So, and I think it's done at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and maybe some of the engine manufacturers have them too. I've never actually seen it, but it is actually a real thing. And what they will do is they will figure out the weight of the bird that they need to test, and they do that by looking at the damaging bird strikes. And they will go out to the market and buy a chicken or a duck or whatever is in the supermarket. And they will use that as their model. They don't use live birds, but they do use that as a model to test the weight of the bird in the engine. And if it fails, they have to go back to the drawing board and start over again and try to figure out what they can do to improve the engine so that it will take an 8-pound bird or a 5-pound bird and continue to run.
One of the questions that, was on here was, can just one dove cause that kind of damage to the aircraft, or is it usually a flock of doves?
With the doves, it usually is one, but you are exactly right. They do fly in flocks, and so they can do significant damage. We have had military aircraft crash because of doves. And the problem with there's two issues. One is the military aircraft fly a lot faster and low level, or they're in that low level environment for a longer period of time, and they only usually have a single engine. And so this is a very crucial thing for military aircraft. These commercial aircraft have two engines. They're larger engines, and they can get up and they can get out of the bird zone much faster than a military aircraft. So it depends on the speed that you're going and what part of the aircraft the bird hits. But a mourning dove is a 4-ounce bird, and a 4-ounce bird can do damage depending on the speed of the aircraft and what part of the aircraft it hits.
Okay, Kristine, we got a question here.
I saw that somebody guessed Santa's reindeer.
Yeah,
That was good.
and this is Marty. I'm not going to make a question, make a comment. Back in the early 70s, I was working on carbon fiber and graphite fiber composites for turbine blades. And working with Wright Pat, we found out that they were using frozen chickens. And it became apparent that they probably ought to thaw them out before they used them as a projectile.
Yeah, I think I've heard that joke that the Brits were trying to do the same tests, and they kept wondering why they were flunking the test, and somebody reminded them they needed to thaw the birds before they used them.
Yes, I've got a question concerning the barbels and the nodules. You indicated that some of them are star-shaped, some of them are triangular shaped, some of them are oddly shaped. And I was wondering, because I know each feather serves a function, does each barbel serve and nodule serve a different function for each bird, or they just happen to be that way?
So that's an excellent point, and I should have talked about that more. We actually don't know the function of those nodes. And I've been studying it and thinking about it a lot. The only thing I can tell you is basically they do follow a phylogenetic signal. So all of the birds, all of the different families of birds in the same order will have a similar microscopic character for the most part. There are always exceptions, but all of the ducks, geese, and swans have a general conformation of the expanded nodes only at the tips. So there's something to the evolutionary history of these barbules and these nodes. But the other thing I looked at, and that, some people have proposed that maybe these nodes help keep the barbules from becoming entangled. But we do know that the down of the birds is responsible for insulation and the insulatory properties. And so I did a little study on the ducks to determine if there was any variation in the amount of air that maybe is trapped in those barbules, in those nodes. And what I discovered was that diving ducks, the ducks that have to go down to the bottom and dive deeper for their food, have fewer of those nodes than the dabbling ducks, like the mallards that sort of bob around on top and feed on whatever's floating, whatever vegetation's floating. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because if you're like a little cork, flapping around or bobbing around on the water, it doesn't matter that you have a lot of air in your plumage. If you're diving, you don't want the air in your plumage because it would take more energy for you to get to the bottom and feed. And so I think maybe in some of these species, these nodes do actually help trap air and improve the insulatory properties of the feathers. Whereas if you have other ways, like penguins don't have these nodes, but they have a huge layer of fat. And they do deep diving, so they need to be able to get that air out of their plumage very quickly. So it may have something to do. Also, it may have a function, but there definitely is a phylogenetic signal there of relatedness of these birds. Good question.
I have a question about the engines. Well, let's say you have a desk fan. There's a screen on the desk fan, so you can't stick your fingers in or anything else. Why don't they put a screen on the intake of the jet engines?
The engineers tell us that it would disrupt the airflow so much that the engine wouldn't function properly. And the damage people tell us that even if you have a screen, if you have a little dense bullet, like a dense bodied bird that goes through that, it's going to take that material with it into the engine, which might actually be worse than a soft bodied bird. So these are engineering questions that have been asked, and it's the way it was explained to me is it's sort of like a drain. Like if you put a screen over the drain in your bathtub, it limits the water that's going to go out the drain, and you need that air to go through the engine to make it function properly.
Okay, thank you.
This is Barbara. So I was wondering if you know what steps are the airports taking to eliminate these bird strikes? They're not dispatching the birds, are they?
There's lots of tools in the toolbox. The very last tool that they will use under extreme circumstances is euthanization, or actually removing birds from the airport with using lethal methods. But there are simple solutions, and it depends on the bird. At Dover Air Force Base, they have about 200,000 snow geese that cross that airfield every day in the wintertime, going out in the morning at sunrise to feed and coming back in the evening to roost. And you know what? They don't fly at sunrise and sunset. They do no training at all in the wintertime because of that issue. Some other things they can do, if you have a rodent problem because your grass is too tall, and they're tunneling through the grass and hawks are coming to feed on those rodents, they can cut the grass short and the rodents won't be in there hiding. Problem with that is then it attracts other species of birds like geese that like to have flat surfaces to rest on and feed on. So the geese will come in and then they have to start letting the grass grow again. So it really is a specific problem to the airfield and to the species and to the time of year and to what tools you have available. But if you ever, like in Texas, there's a lot there at Dallas. There's a woman who works there. Her name is Kathy Boyles. She is a wonderful airport manager, and she is really on top of it. That's a huge airport. I don't know how many, I think 1,400 acres that she manages. And her only problem right now are pigeons. And what she does is just put screening around the hangar so that the pigeons can't come in there and roost. So it really depends on what the bird is, but all of the people that I've ever worked with use euthanize methods as the very last resort.
This is Kathy. I know the airport near my in-laws in Traverse City, Michigan. They had a dog for several years that had the run of the runway, and if it saw birds out there, they'd say, "Hey, go get it," and it would chase them away.
Yeah,
that's why
dogs are very good at controlling geese, and they love it. They have so much fun. Some airports have falcons that are trained to chase away swallows and smaller birds, and some people now are using remote controlled devices that look like birds to scare away other birds and be like predators on the airfield. So it's the big operation. There's like no silver bullet though. And a lot of people are looking for that silver bullet, but it's sort of like pest management. I mean, you just have to figure out what tool works on what bird and how to keep these things apart.
Okay. Any more questions here in the room? Okay, Kristine, I can't see the chat right now. Were there any more questions there?
There's a couple. Is the structure of the owl feather and nodes that allows an owl to fly so silently?
Okay. I don't know if these downy structures have anything to do with the silent flight of the owls, but of course the owls do have those extra long barbules on their pennaceous parts of the feathers, which make them a lot softer. And a lot of people think that is, and it has been actually proposed that makes them fly more silently. I don't know about the downy part though. I really don't know. Because if you think about it, that's like the undercoat. It's like, how would that prevent the sound from traveling? So I don't know.
And then we just had a comment. Israel's pilots have to know birds' flight behavior as part of their training.
Interesting. So some pilots have told us that, especially planes that fly slow, like helicopters and a lot of these smaller privately owned planes, the pilots will tell us when they're coming onto a bird, the bird will actually dive and some actual pull up. So, I mean, maybe there is something to that. Maybe different birds react differently when they see planes coming at them. There's a lot of work being done now on trying to make the plane more visible to the bird. And so people are studying bird vision to see if there's any color or any kind of lighting or anything that could be put on the airplane to make it visible so that the bird can see it coming, because they come fast and now they're very quiet. And so a lot of times birds don't have time to react. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very interesting. Okay. Kristine, did you have any further comments there?
No, I was just going to say that there is a really cool tool. I think it's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service tool that for feather identification. Is that right, Carla? Is it U.S. Fish and
Yes.
Wildlife?
Yep.
And it's pretty cool. You go in and it's got like 6 different categories where you can pick colors or patterns and things like that and try to figure out what kind of feather you're looking at.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Guess now we will take a break. Let's see. Check my handy dandy list here. I know we have cake for Chris in honor of Chris's 5,000. Oh, he's happy. In honor of his 5,000 hours. So please grab some of that, and we'll try to be back in about 10 minutes or so. Okay, thank you.